The Messerschmitt Bf 109 wasn't just Germany's most iconic World War II fighter, it was the most produced fighter aircraft in history. Over 33,000 were built, and it turned young Luftwaffe pilots into living legends, or martyrs. It helped shape the terrifying dominance of the German Air Force and led to some of the highest kill counts ever recorded by a single pilot. But while its sleek design and raw power made it a symbol of Nazi air superiority, it hid a deadly flaw, one that didn't just hurt Germany's enemies. It killed its own men before they ever fired a shot. Thousands of German pilots died not from enemy fire, but from something baked into the design of the aircraft itself. This is the hidden story of the Bf 109 and the dark truth behind the deaths of over 1,700 of its own. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles made one thing painfully clear. Germany was not to have an air force, period. No combat aircraft, no training programs, not even the blueprint for a fighter plane. The world believed it had clipped Germany's wings for good. But what the Allies didn't understand was that the silence was just a disguise. Beneath the surface, behind locked factory doors, and under the label of civil aviation, Germany was preparing for the next war long before anyone else saw it coming. By the early 1930s, Adolf Hitler had risen to power, and the masks began to come off. Germany's aviation industry was quietly advancing in plain sight. And at the center of this rapid transformation was an ambitious Bavarian designer, Willy Messerschmitt. His creation would become one of the deadliest symbols of Nazi air power, the Bf 109. Fast, sleek, and radically advanced for its time, the Bf 109 didn't just represent Germany's technological leap, it became the very face of the Luftwaffe. The world's first glimpse came in 1936, during the Berlin Olympics. Amidst the orchestrated pageantry and propaganda, Germany unveiled the Bf 109 prototype in the most chilling way possible. It shattered the international speed record. Even more disturbing? That record was set using a British-built Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine. The message was loud. Germany wasn't just back, it was ahead. And worse, they were using foreign technology to do it. But this was only the beginning. The Luftwaffe had plans for this new weapon, and they were ready to unleash it. By 1937, the Bf 109 wasn't just a prototype. It was the most advanced single-seat fighter in the world. All-metal construction, a closed cockpit, retractable landing gear, everything about it screamed speed and power. While other countries were still flying wood and canvas biplanes, Germany had just reinvented aerial warfare. It was tested in Spain during the brutal Spanish Civil War, where it tore through outdated Soviet planes and earned its stripes against early monoplane rivals. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was the backbone of a future war machine. By the time Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the Bf 109 led the charge, dominating the skies with ruthless precision. It was Germany's blade, and it was cutting through Europe without resistance. Armed initially with two synchronized machine guns firing through the propeller arc, the aircraft was deadly even in its early form. But when German intelligence discovered that the British Spitfire was entering service with 8 wing-mounted guns, the arms race escalated. The Bf 109 evolved. Two 20mm cannons were added to the wings, capable of firing high-explosive shells that detonated on impact. These weren't just bullets. These were sky-borne grenades. The plane continued to morph with each mission and each battlefront. It was fitted with more powerful Daimler-Benz engines, better weapon systems, and even a cannon that fired through the hollow propeller shaft, a marvel of engineering. But this constant evolution hid a deadly secret, one that wouldn't become clear until thousands of pilots had already paid the price. Despite all its innovation, all its firepower, and all its deadly precision, the Bf-109 had a flaw so dangerous it would kill over 1,700 of Germany's own pilots, and not in combat. The problem wasn't in the air, it was on the ground. You see, in the quest for speed and aerodynamic performance, Messerschmitt had made a crucial sacrifice. Instead of mounting the landing gear on the wings, like many fighters of the era, the Bf-109's undercarriage was fixed directly to the narrow fuselage. The result was a clean, sleek profile in flight, and a death trap during takeoff and landing. The narrow wheelbase made the plane highly unstable on the runway. Any small mistake, a crosswind, a bump on the ground, was enough to flip the aircraft or send it careening into disaster. Even experienced pilots struggled with it. For rookies, the Bf-109 was almost like a coin toss. Would it take off clean? Or would it slam nose first into the dirt? That gamble cost Germany dearly. During training alone, over 10% of all Bf-109s were destroyed in non-combat accidents. The Luftwaffe lost more than 1,750 pilots to crashes that had nothing to do with enemy fire. These weren't battlefield casualties. They were mechanical failures, structural flaws, and fatal design choices that never got fixed. Even as the war raged on and the aircraft evolved, that flaw remained. The Bf-109's legacy would be tied not just to its battlefield prowess, but to the silent, brutal toll it took on its own men before they ever had a chance to face the enemy. By the summer of 1940, the Bf-109 wasn't just feared. It was feared for a reason. It had helped the Luftwaffe blitz through Poland, overrun France, and humiliate Allied air forces across Europe. But now, it was about to face its greatest challenge yet: the Royal Air Force. The Battle of Britain was not just a campaign, it was a test of endurance, range, and tactics. And here's where the Bf-109's strength became its weakness. Designed as a short-range interceptor, the 109 wasn't built for long-distance escort missions. Yet that's exactly what it was tasked with: flying cover for German bombers from bases in France, across the English Channel to Britain, and back. On paper, the plan looked daring. In the sky, it was a death sentence. Once the Bf-109s crossed into British airspace, they had just 15 minutes of combat time before needing to turn around. There was no margin for error. If a dogfight dragged on too long, or if pilots lost their bearings, they wouldn't make it back. And many didn't. One Luftwaffe veteran recalled, "The clock was always ticking. Every bullet we fired was a gamble. Stay too long, and the channel becomes your grave." The problem was compounded by speed. German bombers flew significantly slower than the 109s, forcing the fighters to reduce speed and stay in tight formation. It was like telling a lion to babysit a turtle in a war zone. Spitfires and Hurricanes exploited this limitation relentlessly. Time and again, the 109s would be forced to break off, leaving bombers exposed and vulnerable. Many German pilots died not in glorious battle, but simply because they ran out of fuel on the way home. By the end of the Battle of Britain, over 600 Bf-109s had been destroyed, and the Luftwaffe had lost its aura of invincibility. For the first time, the limits of the 109 were exposed, and the myth of German air dominance had cracked. After the devastating losses over Britain, Germany turned its gaze to North Africa. The campaign would stretch the Bf-109 to its environmental limits. The desert wasn't just hot, it was unforgiving. Sand got into everything. Engines choked, filters clogged, hydraulics failed. And the 109th, designed for the skies over Europe, wasn't built for the Sahara. To survive, it had to adapt. fast. Enter the tropical variant, a modified version of the Bf-109 fitted with air filters, drop tanks, and desert camouflage. On paper, the upgrades were enough to keep the fighter flying. But in practice, the aircraft struggled. Visibility during landing was poor, and in the heat, the narrow undercarriage issue became even more deadly. Rough desert airstrips and sudden crosswinds turned landings into roulette spins. More than a few pilots didn't survive them. Combat in North Africa also introduced the 109 to a new adversary, the British Supermarine Spitfire Mark V. In the skies over El Alamein, these newer Spitfires matched the Bf-109 in power and agility. What had once been a near unbeatable aircraft was now forced into desperate measures, often stripped of armor or fitted with experimental weapons that hurt more than helped. And yet, despite all this, the Bf-109 endured. It kept evolving, shedding old designs and embracing new ones. Aces were made in the desert, but every kill came with a cost. As the Luftwaffe lost experienced pilots, younger and less trained recruits stepped into the cockpit. The margin for error, already thin, vanished entirely. Veteran pilot Hans Joachim Marseille once said, "The 109 is a sword, but hand it to the untrained, and it cuts both ways." In North Africa, the Bf-109 proved it could adapt, but not without bleeding. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in the history of warfare. Over 3 million German troops poured into the Soviet Union. Leading the assault from the sky was the Bf-109, now updated to the F variant. Faster, lighter, more precise. It had dropped its wing-mounted cannons in favor of concentrating all firepower in the nose, 2 synchronized MG-17s above the engine, and a 20mm motor cannon through the propeller shaft. In Soviet skies, this layout turned the 109 into a sniper. Against outdated Soviet aircraft like the Polikarpov Tu-16 and the Yak-1, the Bf-109 tore through the Red Air Force. And with that dominance came names that would echo through history. Erich Hartmann, the Blonde Knight, would go on to claim 352 aerial victories, more than any pilot in history. Behind him, Gerhard Barkhorn, with 301 kills. These weren't just pilots, they were living legends, or so it seemed. But there was a sinister truth behind those numbers. Unlike Allied pilots, who rotated home after a certain number of missions, Luftwaffe pilots stayed on the front lines indefinitely. No rest, no leave, no relief. If you survived, you flew again, and again, and again, until you didn't. That policy created monsters in the sky, men who flew hundreds of missions, racked up hundreds of kills, but burned out completely. Many of them didn't survive the war. Some cracked from the pressure, others simply vanished into the cold Russian winter. As Germany pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the 109 became both weapon and coffin. And through it all, the design flaw, the narrow undercarriage, still claimed lives. Even after a brutal dogfight, pilots had to fight the landing. Imagine surviving 800 missions only to die on touchdown. That was the reality. In the vast, endless skies of the Eastern Front, the Bf-109 was both king and killer, of the enemy and its own. As World War II dragged into its deadliest years, the Bf-109 wasn't just holding the line, it was being pushed beyond its original design philosophy. The G variant, known as the Gustav, became the most widely produced model of the aircraft. More than 23,000 were built, and while it was a marvel of German engineering, it came at a brutal cost to the men who flew it. The Gustav featured a more powerful Daimler-Benz D B605 engine, giving it better climb rates and higher top speeds. Its firepower was also upgraded. Two 13mm MG-131 machine guns mounted above the engine replaced the older MG-17s, providing far more stopping power. It retained the motor cannon through the propeller hub, which in some variants was upgraded to a 30mm Mk-108, an absolute monster capable of shredding Allied bombers in a single hit. But with great power came devastating compromise. The new weapons, added armor, and extra fuel tanks made the Gustav heavier, significantly heavier. Its wings and fuselage weren't redesigned for the added weight. As a result, the plane's agility suffered. Maneuvering in dogfights became harder, and acceleration worsened. The very upgrades that made it deadly also made it vulnerable. To increase versatility, some Gustavs were outfitted with underwing gun pods, each housing an additional 20mm cannon. But these gondole attachments added even more drag and weight. Aces hated them. The added firepower wasn't worth the sacrifice in performance. "You could kill a bomber," one pilot later recalled, "but you'd be dead meat if a Mustang showed up." The final insult came in the form of rocket launchers, unguided WGR-21 mortars designed to disrupt bomber formations. But these were wildly inaccurate and turned the 109 into a sluggish, floating target. Germany was becoming desperate. The Luftwaffe needed miracle weapons, and they were turning the Bf-109 into a Frankenstein of modifications. Despite this, the Gustav still racked up kills, held the skies, and defended the Reich. But each mission demanded more from the pilots, who were now flying heavier, slower, and increasingly unstable aircraft, with enemies more skilled and aggressive than ever before. By 1944, the situation was catastrophic. The Allied bombing campaign was hammering German industry into the ground. Ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, and aircraft factories were obliterated day after day. Fuel was scarce. Replacement parts were delayed. And worst of all, the pilots were gone. Most of the experienced Luftwaffe aces were dead, missing, or too burned out to continue. The average pilot lifespan on the Western Front had shrunk to just a few weeks. Young trainees, barely out of flight school, were being shoved into cockpits and thrown into the skies against waves of P-51 Mustangs, Spitfire Mark 9s, and P-47 Thunderbolts. They didn't stand a chance. Training had been cut drastically. In the early war years, pilots logged 200-plus hours before combat. By 1944, it was often less than 50. Some rookies had never even fired their weapons in practice before facing live enemy formations. The Bf-109, already known for its tricky takeoffs and lethal landings, was completely unforgiving. These young men were essentially flying coffins, and the flaws didn't go away. The narrow landing gear still caused fatal accidents. The lack of rearward visibility meant rookie pilots were often picked off before they even realized they were under attack. One veteran called it a blindfolded sprint into a minefield. Meanwhile, the Gustav's heavier airframe meant those fatal ground loop crashes became even more common. Luftwaffe instructors admitted that they lost more aircraft in training crashes than in combat during some weeks in 1944. The Bf-109, once a symbol of dominance, had become a symbol of attrition. Germany's Air Force wasn't losing because of inferior machines. It was losing because its machines demanded perfection from men who barely had time to learn how to fly. By the time the Allies crossed into France after D-Day, most surviving 109s were grounded due to lack of fuel or experienced mechanics. The Luftwaffe was no longer a force. It was a graveyard of ghosts and glory. As Berlin crumbled and the Reich collapsed, the Bf-109 still flew. With flames consuming the fatherland and Soviet tanks rolling into Germany, Luftwaffe pilots took to the skies in desperation. Some flew solo suicide missions, others scrambled to defend cities already in ruins. By 1945, many Bf-109s weren't launched from airfields. They were pulled from barns, roads, even autobahns converted into makeshift runways. The final versions, like the K-4 and H variants, were intended to be the ultimate high-altitude fighters. They had pressurized cockpits, advanced radar equipment, and new, more efficient engines. On paper, they could challenge the new Allied jets, but they were too little, too late. The factories building them were bombed out. The fuel they needed was gone. The aces who could master them were either dead or captured. The war had bled Germany dry. Still, the Bf-109 fought on, through rubble, fire, and smoke. Even as the world turned to jets, this piston-driven warhorse refused to fade. But let's not romanticize its ending. The Bf-109 didn't go down in glory. It went down in desperation. Hundreds of them were destroyed on the ground by Allied strafing runs. Others were abandoned. Some pilots defected or surrendered in mid-air, and others, young men barely old enough to shave, were told to fly into the heart of death to defend a nation already lost. In total, more than 1,700 German pilots died in training accidents with the Bf-109. Thousands more died because of its short range, its stubborn handling, or its demand for expert skill. This aircraft claimed more of its own than perhaps any fighter in history. And yet, it's still remembered as a legend. Not because it was perfect, but because it symbolized the brutal truth of war, that even the most advanced machine can't save you when the system behind it is broken. In the end, the Bf-109 was both sword and shroud, a deadly marvel that killed its masters. They were sent in last, and usually didn't come back. On the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, the U.S. Marines had no choice but to deploy the most terrifying weapon in their arsenal, flamethrowers. But while they could clear bunkers and caves, the men carrying them paid the ultimate price. Most didn't survive longer than 4 minutes. This isn't just the story of a weapon, it's the story of hell on Earth, and the men who stepped into it willingly. Recently declassified records and survivor accounts reveal what really happened when fire met stone on the bloodiest island of the Pacific War. Before we talk about fire, we need to talk about stone. Iwo Jima wasn't just any piece of land, it was a black, jagged scar in the Pacific Ocean. Barely 8 square miles of volcanic rock, steaming with sulfur, wind-blasted and dead. There were no trees, no rivers, no shelter. But to the U.S. military, this island was priceless. Located exactly halfway between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese mainland, it sat along the critical air path that B-29 Superfortress bombers flew during bombing runs on Japan. If America could take it, they'd gain a desperately needed emergency landing site and a launch point for fighters to escort bombers. But if they failed, it would become a graveyard. The Japanese command saw this coming months in advance, and what they did to prepare defied all logic. Under orders from General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, they didn't simply dig trenches, they transformed the island into a death trap. They carved over 11 miles of tunnels through the island's core. Command bunkers, mortar nests, machine gun pillboxes, and supply stations were buried into the mountainside, reinforced with steel and concrete, and hidden so well even aerial reconnaissance couldn't detect them. The objective was simple: bleed the Americans until they broke. Kuribayashi, unlike other Japanese generals, knew the Americans would eventually win. but he was determined to make them pay so heavily for every inch that the US might think twice about invading Japan itself. His strategy was to delay, ambush, and sacrifice. There would be no last-ditch charges, no suicidal banzai screams, just silence, traps, and death from below. And so by the time American Marines landed in February 1945, they weren't walking onto an island. They were walking into a volcano designed to kill them slowly. On the morning of February 19, 1945, the U.S. unleashed one of the heaviest pre-invasion bombardments of the war. Naval guns pounded the island for days, while bomber planes dropped tons of explosives, cratering the earth and painting the sky with fire. But what they didn't realize was they were bombing ghosts. Most of the Japanese soldiers weren't in trenches or visible bunkers. They were deep underground, untouched, and waiting. Then came the landing. Waves of Higgins boats dropped thousands of Marines onto the Black Shores. But this beach wasn't like the ones in Normandy. The sand was volcanic ash, fine, soft, and sticky. It swallowed boots, jammed tank treads, and slowed movement to a crawl. There were no trees to hide behind, no rocks for cover. Just flat blackness and sky. At first, the silence was eerie. For over an hour, there was no gunfire. Some Marines thought the bombardment had worked. Others were more suspicious. And then, just as the beach was full, it started. From hidden pillboxes and camouflaged slopes, the Japanese opened fire with everything they had. Pre-sighted artillery exploded in the surf. Machine guns raked across the sand. Mortars landed among the landing craft. Within minutes, chaos replaced confidence. Bodies fell faster than medics could respond. Radios crackled with confusion. Vehicles burned. The first Marines who'd landed were still trying to climb up the beach slope. And now they were being joined by fresh waves, all of them sitting ducks. What the Japanese had done was ingenious and brutal. They let the enemy come in fully, get comfortable, and then cut off their escape. Kuribayashi's forces weren't aiming to hold the beach. They wanted to turn it into a killing field. And it worked. Even when Marines managed to push inland, they found themselves in a nightmarish landscape of craters, tunnels, and death that didn't follow the rules of warfare. There were no front lines. You could clear an enemy pillbox, only to have them reappear from behind. That's when American commanders realized traditional weapons wouldn't win this fight. The deeper the Marines pushed into Iwo Jima, the stranger and deadlier the fight became. There were no safe zones, no clear enemy lines. The Japanese had built a fortress inside the island itself, and the most terrifying part of that fortress were the pillboxes. These weren't just concrete bunkers, they were masterpieces of death. Each one was reinforced to survive direct hits from tanks and naval guns. Their entrances were hidden behind rocks, angled to avoid being hit. Their gun ports were camouflaged and overlapping, meaning each pillbox could cover the next. A Marine couldn't just charge one. If he did, he'd get cut down by another he hadn't even seen. What made them worse was what lay beneath. Almost all of the pillboxes were connected by subterranean tunnels. You could destroy a bunker with grenades or explosives and move on, only for the Japanese to sneak back into it later and ambush you from behind. The Marines weren't just fighting forward, they were fighting ghosts behind them, beside them, even underneath them. Grenades, rifle fire, and satchel charges only work if someone could get close enough. But getting close meant crawling over open ground under machine gun fire. And even if you reached the pillbox, the zigzag interior often absorbed the blast, sparing the defenders inside. It was a war of inches. And it was tearing the Marines apart. Then, someone brought up an old, nearly forgotten weapon, the flamethrower. It wasn't new technology. Flamethrowers had existed in World War I, but on Iwo Jima, they became the only solution. Fire didn't care about zigzag walls or oxygen levels. It didn't bounce off reinforced doors. It flooded every space, robbed men of air, and made hiding impossible. The Marines began strapping fire to their backs and sending men into hell armed with nothing but a pistol and a flame. But what the flamethrower could do to the enemy was just the beginning. The real darkness would come when we saw what it did to the men who used it. The first American flamethrowers to hit the beaches at Iwo Jima were using the M2 flamethrower, a beast of a weapon that demanded both strength and madness to operate. Fully loaded, it weighed around 70 pounds, with 2 heavy fuel tanks and a central nitrogen propellant tank strapped across the operator's back like a bomb waiting for a spark. The tanks were filled with a thickened mix of gasoline and diesel, a jelly that stuck to anything it touched and kept burning. The nozzle, held like a rifle, had a small white phosphorus igniter at the tip. When the operator pulled the trigger, it unleashed a roaring stream of flame up to 30 yards away. For just 10 seconds total. 10 seconds. That was the difference between life and death. Every operator knew you had one chance, one breath of fire before your weapon ran dry, and you became the most hunted man on the battlefield. Because make no mistake, if the Japanese saw you, they would try to kill you first. The flamethrower wasn't just another weapon. It was the most feared and hated weapon on Iwo Jima. From the moment it spat fire, every enemy rifle, grenade, and mortar zeroed in on its operator. Japanese soldiers called them demons, and their commanders issued direct orders to eliminate them at any cost. Flamethrower operators were often ambushed, shot on sight, or worse, captured. That, more than anything, terrified them. One Marine later recounted watching a fellow flamethrower trooper charge a cave, aim his weapon, and have it misfire. Before he could retreat, 2 Japanese soldiers grabbed him and pulled him into the darkness. For 2 days, Marines nearby heard his screams. Then they stopped. There was no rescue. That's why flamethrower men often begged their squad mates to shoot them if they ever got captured. They knew what would happen. And even if they survived, many never talked about what they'd seen. The sound, the smell, the memory of what fire did to human beings in enclosed spaces. Carrying that burden, literally and mentally, broke men. Even those who survived the war came home with nightmares that never left. The flamethrower wasn't just terrifying because of what it could do, it was terrifying because it forced a new kind of moral reckoning. You weren't shooting someone from 300 yards. You were burning them alive at 30 feet. And while most flamethrower operators said they were simply doing their duty, many also admitted, years later, that they never truly came to peace with it. The M2 didn't just shoot fire. It created an inferno that reached over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside caves and pillboxes, it vaporized the air. It consumed all oxygen. In seconds, the heat and lack of breathable air caused near-instant collapse. Some post-war medical studies claimed victims likely lost consciousness before feeling pain. Others weren't so sure. But to the men who used it, it never felt clean. It never felt right. One operator described the moment he cleared a pillbox with fire. When he climbed inside after the smoke cleared, what he saw made him vomit. He sat outside in silence for an hour before his commanding officer ordered him back into action. There was no time for emotions, no space for guilt. And then there were the tanks themselves, highly flammable, heavily targeted. Some Marines thought a single bullet would cause the tanks to explode in a fireball. That wasn't entirely true. The fuel was pressurized, not rigged like a bomb, but it didn't matter. Just the idea that one misstep could turn you into a human torch was enough to haunt every step. The real horror was psychological. Flamethrower operators, after witnessing what their weapon did, often refused to use it again. They begged to be reassigned. Some threw up before missions. Others confessed decades later they never told their families what they had done. The flamethrower worked. It saved lives by ending impossible standoffs, but it also broke the men who used it. And when the Marines realized they were losing operators faster than they could replace them, they turned to something even more terrifying than a man with a flame strapped to his back. The answer to the carnage wasn't more men, it was more metal. As the casualty rate for flamethrower operators soared past 90%, commanders made a chilling but effective decision: put the flame inside a tank. The result was the M4A3R3 Sherman, a standard medium tank modified to replace its main gun with a flamethrower. It became known as the Flame Sherman. And when it arrived on Iwo Jima, everything changed. Where the backpack M2 could shoot 30 yards, the Flame Sherman had a range of nearly 100 yards. Where a Marine had 10 seconds of fire, the tank carried 300 gallons of fuel, delivering multiple bursts across an entire battlefield. And most importantly, it had armor. It could get close to bunkers and caves without being shredded by machine gun fire. But that armor wasn't invincible. Iwo Jima's terrain was soft volcanic ash that bogged down treads and made easy targets. The Japanese knew that if they could take out the flame tank, they might turn the tide of a battle. And so, every Flame Sherman became a target the second it opened fire. Suicide charges, hidden mines, explosive traps. These tanks were priority kills. Their crews, often trapped inside for hours, risked being incinerated in a second if the wrong shell hit the right spot. But they went forward anyway. Tank crews coordinated with infantry who provided cover fire. Regular Shermans flanked them for support. The Flame Shermans would roll up to the front line, angle toward a tunnel entrance or bunker, and unleash a torrent of fire so intense it melted steel and glass. Their psychological impact was devastating. Entire enemy positions surrendered at the sight of them. Others simply fled into the smoke. Some Marines described it as watching hell break open. And yet, for all the horror, they worked. Without them, the island might have never been taken. And for one Marine, Herschel Woody Williams, his mission with the flamethrower would become the stuff of legend. February 23, 1945, the same day the iconic flag was raised over Mount Suribachi, a different battle was raging below the mountain, where the terrain didn't offer hope or symbolism, just death. That's where Herschel Woody Williams, a quiet Marine from West Virginia, was handed what many called a suicide mission: destroy a series of pillboxes that had pinned down his entire company. Multiple Marines had already been killed trying. No one wanted the job. Woody said yes, with 4 fellow Marines assigned to cover him, 2 of whom would die within minutes. Woody began crawling across the volcanic ash, flamethrower strapped to his back, under withering machine gun fire. His target, concrete bunkers fortified with steel and rage. The Japanese had dug them in deep and positioned them to create overlapping kill zones. Any approach was met with immediate, coordinated bursts of fire. But Woody moved with a strange calm, ducking behind ridges and shell craters, choosing his moments. He snuck up on the first pillbox, found a narrow slit near the air vent, and shoved the nozzle in. Then he pulled the trigger. A blast of fire tore through the bunker, followed by screams and then silence. He didn't pause. Woody turned and moved toward the next, then the next. In between assaults, he sprinted back to the rear line to grab another fully loaded flamethrower, as the fuel on each M2 only lasted seconds. By the end of his run, he'd cleared 7 enemy positions, single-handedly. One Japanese soldier charged him with a bayonet. Woody turned, fired a jet of flame, and stopped the attack in its tracks. He was relentless, focused, mechanical. Some would later say he moved like he was already dead, like nothing could touch him. When the dust settled, the Americans advanced because of him. What made Woody different wasn't his strength. It was his calmness under fire and refusal to let fear paralyze him. He didn't brag. He didn't break. And when the war ended, Woody didn't think of himself as a hero. He couldn't forget what he saw or what his weapon did. But the Marines never forgot him. Woody Williams was awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the only flamethrower operator in World War II to receive that distinction. His story became legend, but the truth behind that medal was far more haunting than heroic. Woody Williams lived until 2022, passing away at the age of 98. But even in his final years, the memories of Iwo Jima lingered just beneath the surface. In interviews, he admitted he couldn't remember much of the actual battle. Likely a defense mechanism, a way for his mind to protect itself. What he did remember were the faces of the Marines who didn't come back, the friends who had laid down their lives to give him just a few more seconds, the ones whose names were etched in stone while he walked among the living. "I've never considered myself a hero," Woody often said. "The heroes are the ones who never came home." His humility masked a deeper torment. Even decades later, Woody wrestled with the moral weight of what he'd done. His weapon didn't just kill, it incinerated. It didn't just eliminate threats, it erased them. And for all the strategic value, it left scars on both the enemy and the operator. Woody never glorified the flamethrower. He respected its necessity, but he mourned its reality. And he wasn't alone. Flamethrower operators from the Pacific War rarely spoke of their role. Many refused to tell their families what they did. Others lived in isolation, consumed by guilt or crushed by trauma. Veterans groups reported disproportionately high rates of alcoholism, depression, and even suicide among former flame troops. It was the weapon that did its job too well. Psychiatrists who studied combat trauma in the post-war years noted that those who used flamethrowers experienced moral injury more deeply than others. They weren't just taking lives, they were extinguishing them in ways that felt unnatural. That memory of flesh and fire, of cave screams echoing through the smoke, stayed locked inside. The military retired the flamethrower in the 1970s. Officially, it was outdated. Unofficially, it was too brutal to justify anymore. But its legacy didn't fade. Not for the men who carried it, not for those who faced it, and not for those who still see it in nightmares. In the decades after Iwo Jima, the world began to look at flamethrowers differently, not as tools of necessity, but as symbols of the darkest edge of war. Nations quietly removed them from their arsenals. Military ethics experts debated whether their use should be considered a war crime. And international treaties began forming around their limitation. In 1980, the United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons listed incendiary weapons as subject to restriction. While flamethrowers weren't outright banned, their deployment in civilian areas or against populations became strictly regulated. Even modern militaries, including the United States, began distancing themselves from their use. It wasn't just about effectiveness anymore, it was about conscience. Because at its core, the flamethrower forced a confrontation with what warfare truly was. Not glory, but horror. Not flags and medals, but screams and fire. No other weapon brought soldiers as close to their enemy, or demanded they erase them in such personal, intimate violence. The men of Iwo Jima who carried these weapons didn't ask for them. They weren't monsters. They were Marines, given the only option they had to survive a battlefield designed to kill them. They were sacrificial weapons, human torches sent into the dark, knowing that few, if any, would return. Out of 335 flamethrower operators deployed at Iwo Jima, only 18 came back alive. That's a 92% casualty rate. Most died before they could fire. Others were caught after the flame went out. Those who returned were never the same. But they did what they had to. Because in that volcanic hellscape, there was no other way forward. In the end, Iwo Jima was captured. The flag went up. The war in the Pacific moved closer to Japan. But for those who carried fire on their backs, the victory came at a cost that history rarely talks about. And maybe that's why this story matters, because some weapons leave wounds that never heal, and some men carry burdens that no metal can ever lift. Of the nearly 40,000 German sailors who stepped into a U-boat during World War II, only around 6,000 ever came home. The rest? Lost to the depths of the Atlantic, crushed, drowned, burned, or left drifting in silence. Germany's underwater fleet didn't just hunt Allied ships, they became hunted themselves. Behind every successful strike was a crew that lived in suffocating, deadly conditions where every dive could be their last. So how did one of the most feared naval forces in the war become one of its most doomed? The truth lies below the surface, in cold steel corridors, leaking pipes, and pressure that could tear you apart in a heartbeat. This is the terrifying story of why 91% of U-boat crews never made it back. Also, consider subscribing for history's darkest hours. Before the world had even seen its first global war, Germany was already dreaming of war beneath the waves. But those early dreams looked more like death traps than war machines. In 1850, an ambitious engineer named Wilhelm Bauer designed what he believed would be the future of naval warfare, a primitive submarine prototype built more on imagination than viable engineering. It sank almost immediately on its test run. Bauer and his crew somehow survived, but the concept remained just that. An idea waiting for the world to catch up. It took decades for that idea to resurface. In the early 20th century, Germany began developing a true underwater fleet, not for exploration or experimentation, but for power. Their goal wasn't to challenge the Royal Navy's battleships directly. That was suicide. Britain ruled the surface, but if Germany couldn't win the battle above the waves, they'd fight below them. And the U-boat became their weapon of choice. By the time World War I exploded across Europe, Germany had 28 U-boats ready for action. These weren't the sleek steel predators we imagine today. They were noisy, slow, and barely stable. Most of their time was spent sailing on the surface, only diving when they had to attack or avoid being spotted. Diesel engines charged bulky batteries above water, which then powered weak electric motors once submerged. That gave them limited stealth and a narrow window to strike. But even with these limitations, the U-boats changed the game almost immediately. In September 1914, U-9 attacked 3 British cruisers in under an hour, sinking all 3 and killing over 1,400 sailors. That one ambush shocked the world. Suddenly, naval commanders had to rewrite the rulebook. The enemy could strike from nowhere, without warning, and vanish into the ocean. At first, German U-boats followed what were known as prize rules, a set of gentlemen's guidelines from another era. They'd surface, stop a merchant vessel, allow the crew to escape, and then sink it. But that courtesy disappeared quickly. The British began arming their merchant ships, turning them into disguised traps called Q-ships. U-boats would approach what looked like an easy target, only to be torn apart by hidden guns. Once that line was crossed, Germany abandoned the idea of fairness. Civilians, merchant ships, hospital vessels, nothing was off limits. The term unrestricted submarine warfare was born, and it was brutal. Germany's U-boat campaign in World War I left behind a trail of destruction and fear. Over 5,000 ships were sunk. But when the war ended, so did the program, at least on paper. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, specifically banned Germany from building or possessing submarines. The Allies believed that by outlawing the weapon entirely, they could prevent another underwater onslaught. But banning something on paper doesn't erase it from memory or strategy. Behind the scenes, German naval leaders never gave up on their prized weapon. Instead, they got creative. They opened design offices in neutral countries and began building submarines for foreign navies. Ostensibly, these were exports, but in reality, they were trial runs for the next generation of German undersea warfare. Every screw, every gauge, every inch of pressure-tested hull plating was part of a long con. They weren't just waiting for permission, they were preparing for the next war. When Adolf Hitler came to power in the 1930s, secrecy became unnecessary. The new regime openly tore up the Treaty of Versailles and began rearming across every military front. Tanks, planes, and most importantly, submarines. By 1935, the charade was over. Germany had rebuilt its U-boat fleet from the ground up. But this time, it wasn't just about sinking ships. It was about reshaping strategy altogether. Enter Admiral Karl Dönitz. Dönitz didn't want lone submarines hunting solo targets. He envisioned something far more terrifying. Packs of U-boats coordinating their attacks, circling convoys like predators closing in for the kill. This wasn't theoretical. It became policy. And the tactic, called Wolf Pack, would soon turn the Atlantic into a hunting ground. This time, they weren't playing by old rules. Germany wasn't just building a fleet. They were building a machine of economic destruction. When World War II began in 1939, Germany didn't wait to slowly build pressure. They unleashed it immediately, and beneath the waves. On the very first day of Britain's involvement in the war, a German U-boat torpedoed the SS Athenia, a civilian passenger liner. Over 100 non-combatants were killed. The official German explanation? A mistake. But the truth was already clear. Civilians were no longer off limits. The war at sea would be total. This time around, Germany wasn't relying on the fragile U-boats of World War I. Their main weapon was the Type 7 U-boat, a faster, deadlier, more refined vessel that became the backbone of the Kriegsmarine. At over 220 feet long, the Type 7 could travel nearly 9,000 nautical miles before needing to refuel. Its theoretical dive limit was 750 feet, far deeper than Allied depth charges were calibrated for. But in reality, most dives stayed in the 300 to 500-foot range. That was enough to escape, and enough to collapse under pressure if things went wrong. These boats weren't designed for ship-to-ship warfare. Their entire purpose was to sever Britain's supply lines. Every freighter, every tanker, every troop ship became a target. No engagement was random. It was all part of a strategy to starve the island into surrender, without ever setting foot on it. Dönitz's wolf pack strategy made that threat even more potent. Rather than lone submarines acting independently, groups of U-boats coordinated attacks across wide stretches of ocean. They would lurk during the day, track convoys from a distance, then move in under cover of darkness to strike from multiple angles. This made it almost impossible for escorts to protect every ship. They were outnumbered, surrounded, and caught in chaos. Convoys that once offered protection now became floating bait balls, and the wolves were circling. One successful torpedo didn't just mean a sunken ship. It meant thousands of tons of cargo gone, soldiers drowned, and critical resources lost to the sea. Sometimes it meant more. If the target was a troop carrier or a fuel tanker, it could set back entire military operations. Germany's U-boats were now not only effective, they were everywhere. The Atlantic had become a minefield with no mines, just silent predators, waiting, and the Allies were running out of time to adapt. In the early months of World War II, the U-boat war escalated rapidly, and so did the list of acceptable targets. What began as a campaign to cripple enemy logistics quickly blurred the lines between soldier and civilian, combatant and bystander. By all accounts, the SS Athenia was a passenger ship, not a war vessel. Yet on September 3, 1939, U-30 torpedoed it without warning. Over 100 innocent lives were lost, including women and children. The German Navy called it an accident, but to the rest of the world, it was a chilling preview of the war's new rules. There weren't any. In theory, submarine commanders were supposed to follow guidelines similar to prize rules from the previous war. Those rules stated that a merchant ship had to be warned before being attacked, giving the crew a chance to abandon ship. But commanders soon found this system suicidal. Britain had begun converting seemingly harmless merchant ships into heavily armed decoys called Q ships. To a U-boat captain looking through a periscope, there was no way to tell the difference, and that's when mercy stopped being an option. From that point forward, U-boats rarely surfaced to issue warnings. Civilians became legitimate targets. Merchant ships carrying food, fuel, or even mail were torpedoed without hesitation. Any ship bound for Britain was seen as part of the war machine, and therefore marked for destruction. The Atlantic, once the passage of commerce and travel, had become a graveyard. It wasn't uncommon for U-boats to fire on lifeboats or leave survivors drifting for days, not out of cruelty, but because rescuing them would give away the submarine's location. Cold logic replaced compassion. And in the twisted calculus of war, the loss of a cargo ship wasn't just a victory, it was a strategic weapon. Every ton of supplies that sank into the sea tightened the economic noose around Britain's throat. This was not just warfare, it was psychological warfare. U-boat attacks weren't designed solely to sink steel, they were meant to sink morale. And as the kill count climbed, so did the silence from Berlin. The High Command no longer cared how the missions were carried out, only that they succeeded. But what made U-boats truly terrifying wasn't just the intent behind them. It was the method. To understand the sheer horror of a U-boat attack, you need to understand the torpedo. It wasn't just a missile, it was a mechanical predator launched silently into the sea, armed with just enough power to tear a ship apart. Each U-boat typically carried around 14 torpedoes, but only a few could be fired at a time. That meant every launch had to count. The crew didn't rely on computers or digital readouts. The firing solution, course, angle, distance, and speed, was all calculated by hand. There were two main types of torpedoes used by the Germans. The G7A was steam-powered, fast, and deadly, but it left a white wake that could be spotted by watchmen on the target ship. The G7E was slower but electrically powered and silent. It left no trace, just calm water, until the explosion. But they weren't perfect. In fact, early models were notorious for malfunctions. Some veered off course. Some didn't detonate. A few even made the unthinkable mistake, circling back toward the very U-boat that had fired them. Still, when a torpedo worked as intended, the results were catastrophic. A direct hit to the hull could flood compartments in seconds, splitting a ship like a twig snapped in half. And since most Allied freighters and troop ships carried fuel, ammunition, or explosives, secondary blasts were common. Fire erupted. Debris rained into the sky. Lifeboats were torn from their rails or engulfed in flames. There were no nearby ports, no rapid response teams. Rescuers, if they came at all, might not arrive for days. That's if they even knew a ship had been sunk. Many disappeared without a trace, taking their crew and cargo down with them. Survivors had little chance. They clung to debris or inflatable rafts, drifting in cold water, facing exposure, dehydration, and sharks. Some were picked up by passing convoys. Others simply vanished. The U-boat crew, meanwhile, listened silently through sonar as the ship's final groans echoed through the water. If the sounds faded, they moved on to the next target. If enemy escorts responded, they prepared to dive, fast. To the Allies, these torpedo strikes were cruel and devastating. To the Germans, they were efficient. But with every successful attack, the U-boats sent one more message across the Atlantic. No one is safe. Not out here. By late 1942, the hunters of the Atlantic had become the hunted. Germany's U-boat force, once invisible, invincible, and untouchable, was suddenly bleeding. And the Allied navies had learned how to make them bleed harder. Technology had finally caught up with terror. The Royal Navy and U.S. Navy deployed new sonar systems capable of detecting submerged subs by sound alone. Radar-equipped aircraft began sweeping massive sections of the ocean, capable of spotting a periscope or conning tower from the sky. Depth charges became more precise. Anti-submarine groups known as hunter-killer teams were formed specifically to track U-boats and eliminate them. Escort carriers added air coverage to convoys, and long-range bombers, like the B-24 Liberator, could now patrol parts of the ocean that had previously been out of reach. Then came May 1943, Black May. In a single month, Germany lost 43 U-boats. Let that number sink in. That's nearly one submarine per day, and nearly 2,000 trained submariners gone in less than 4 weeks. The cause wasn't a single battle. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Every new escort, every improved torpedo detector, every aircraft spotting a wake from the sky, it added up. And the German Navy knew it. Karl Dönitz, now commander of the entire German Navy, had to pull back dozens of U-boats just to prevent a total collapse. The Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground. It had become a graveyard. But this shift didn't just affect the mission. It changed the mentality. U-boat crews now set sail, knowing that they might not even see a target before they were attacked. That a convoy might not be the threat, but the bait. Every dive could be the last. Every depth charge rumble could mean a hull breach. Every sonar ping was a ticking clock. The tide had turned, and for the men inside those steel tubes, the ocean was no longer a place of glory. It was a coffin waiting to close. To understand why U-boat crews died in such staggering numbers, it's not enough to look at what happened outside the submarine. You have to understand the horror inside it. Life aboard a German U-boat was not life. It was slow-motion decay in a steel tomb. Crews of 45 to 60 men were packed into a narrow metal tube with barely enough room to stand upright. Sleeping space was so limited that sailors had to hot bunk, rotating in and out of beds soaked with another man's sweat. Some didn't even have a pillow, just a rolled-up uniform. On paper, patrols lasted 6 to 8 weeks. In practice, they often stretched past 12. That meant 3 months trapped in total confinement, with no sunlight, no fresh air, and no escape. The oxygen level dropped within hours of diving, replaced by a cocktail of diesel fumes, sweat, mildew, and body odor. Early U-boats lacked advanced air scrubbers. After 48 hours submerged, headaches were constant. Breathing became labored. Men got dizzy. Some hallucinated. Food spoiled quickly. The first few days offered fresh bread and fruit. After that, meals consisted of canned meat, dry biscuits, and whatever hadn't rotted in the moisture-heavy air. Water was strictly rationed, about 2 gallons per man per day for everything: drinking, cooking, cleaning. Most didn't bathe once during a mission. Skin infections were everywhere. The constant dampness led to rashes, ulcers, and fungal growth. The crew called it U-boat rot. Sailors' feet turned raw from standing in their own sweat and engine grease for weeks. Boredom became torment, and silence was law. The smallest sound, a dropped wrench, a cough, could give away the sub's location to sonar. You weren't just stuck in the dark, you had to be quiet in the dark. Privacy didn't exist. Nor did dignity. Men relieved themselves in buckets' feet from where others ate and slept. When a crew member died, his body was stored in the cooling compartment with the torpedoes until it began to rot. And looming above it all was the unspoken truth. Any dive could be their last. Because the worst wasn't just dying. It was knowing how it would happen. The most feared sound on a U-boat wasn't the whine of a faulty engine. It was the ping, that cold, metallic sonar echo bouncing off the hull. It meant someone had found you. And what came next was almost always the same. Depth charges. A depth charge was a steel drum packed with explosives, set to detonate at specific depths. Alone, it could disable a U-boat. In packs, it could tear one apart. The ocean would erupt with muffled thunder. Inside, the lights flickered. Pipes buckled. Bolts snapped. If the hull cracked, the pressure outside would crush the sub like a soda can. 1 second, everything was tense. The next, it was gone. Lights out. Steel imploded inward at 500 miles per hour. There was no screaming, no drowning, just instant obliteration. But not all deaths were merciful. Sometimes the hull held, barely, and the U-boat hit the ocean floor in shallow waters. The impact knocked out the engines. The batteries failed, and the crew was left in complete darkness, surrounded by cold, rising water. They waited. In some cases, the air simply ran out. Men passed out and never woke up. In others, the seawater rose inch by inch, forcing them into higher compartments, praying the ballast tanks could be blown before time ran out. Worst of all were the fires. Battery malfunctions could produce deadly chlorine gas. One leak and a small flame could set off a chemical chain reaction. Inside a U-boat, you're sitting among fuel tanks, battery acid, and high explosive torpedoes. A fire didn't just kill, it sealed your fate. In emergencies, crews had to close pressure doors between compartments to contain damage. But those doors locked both ways. If a fire or flooding broke out and you weren't on the right side of that door, you were left behind, trapped, alone. And the rest of the crew? They had to listen. This wasn't dramatic theory. It was reality. The ocean didn't need to shoot you. It could boil you, crush you, suffocate you. No wonder so many sailors called their patrols death voyages. The enemy wasn't always a destroyer or a plane. Sometimes it was the boat itself. By the end of World War II, the numbers told a story darker than anyone was ready to admit. Out of the 40,000 men who served aboard German U-boats, over 30,000 never returned. That's a staggering loss rate of 75%, the highest of any German military branch. Some estimates push that number even higher, closer to 91% when including training accidents, engine failures, and the final desperate months of the war when untested teenagers were sent out on suicide missions. They weren't just names on a list. They were sons, brothers, husbands. Most were between 18 and 24. They were told they were fighting for their country, but many died before they ever saw combat. Their sacrifice wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Survivors came back changed. Some never stepped on a boat again. Others couldn't sleep without hearing metal creak around them or feeling water rising in their dreams. Germany's U-boat campaign sank over 2,700 Allied ships. It disrupted supply chains. It delayed invasions. It choked the Atlantic with wreckage. But the cost was unimaginable. No medals, no parades, no songs could replace what was lost. Most U-boat wrecks still lie silently on the seabed, forgotten by all but the sea. And inside them are the remains of men who spent their last moments in fear, in darkness, and in silence. Their story isn't one of glory. It's one of tragedy. A mission born in strategy and ended in horror. If you made it this far, consider subscribing. We tell the stories buried beneath history, the ones too often forgotten, the ones that remind us what war really costs. They found his farewell letter decades later, folded neatly, never delivered. Fujio Hayashi was supposed to die for the emperor. He climbed into a kamikaze plane, fueled it for a one-way mission, and stared death in the face. But something happened. His mission was canceled, and he lived. What followed was a lifetime of guilt, silence, and unbearable memory. He was one of the few kamikaze pilots to survive. But surviving wasn't freedom. It was a sentence. And what he revealed about the kamikaze program decades later has shattered the glorified myths and exposed a dark, haunting truth Japan never wanted told. Fujio Hayashi stood on the runway in 1945, barely 20 years old. The rising sun flag hung limp in the windless morning. His Tokotai plane, Japan's version of a flying coffin, sat ready. It had one purpose: to crash into an American warship. Hayashi had said his goodbyes. He had written a final letter to his mother. He had been told this was the most honorable death a man could have, to become a human bullet for the emperor. And he believed it. Or, at least, he thought he did. But something strange happened that morning. The weather turned, clouds rolled in, winds shifted, and in what must have felt like divine irony or cruel fate, his mission was abruptly canceled. He returned to base, still breathing, heart pounding. But the silence that followed was deafening. No fanfare, no ceremony. No one spoke to him. He was a ghost, a man who had stared death in the face and walked away. In a world where that wasn't considered heroic, he wasn't hailed. He was ignored. What haunted Hayashi wasn't just that he lived. It was that the men who went up after him never came back. "I was ready to die," Hayashi later recalled. "Then I lived. That's the part no one prepared us for." This wasn't an isolated glitch. It was the beginning of an unraveling, not just for Hayashi's mind, but for the myth Japan had built around the kamikaze. A myth that turned young boys into weapons. A myth that still echoed in the silence of a cancelled mission. To understand why Hayashi felt more ashamed of surviving than proud of living, you have to understand the kamikaze machine. Japan didn't just build planes, it built an ideology, one that glorified death as the ultimate expression of loyalty. Boys as young as 15 were pulled from classrooms and told their deaths would purify the soul of the nation. Training for kamikaze pilots was brutally short. Less about flying, more about obedience. They were shown films of heroic deaths, given swords, taught that surrender was worse than annihilation. And when it came time to volunteer, many were simply pressured, not asked, expected. One survivor wrote, "I raised my hand because everyone else did. How could I not? They would have called me a coward." They wrote final letters to families, often dictated or censored by military handlers. Some included pressed flowers, others enclosed hair or fingernails for Buddhist rites. One wrote, "Mother, forgive me. I am scared, but I go anyway." Fujio Hayashi wrote his too. They practiced by diving planes into mock targets. But those weren't the real targets. The real target was their spirit. By the time they climbed into that cockpit, they weren't soldiers anymore. They were sacrifices. And most chilling of all, the kamikaze program wasn't born of ancient tradition. It was invented, rushed, and deployed in desperation in the final stages of the war. It was a last gasp wrapped in fanfare. Hayashi had been willing to give everything, but no one asked if he truly understood what he was giving up. When Hayashi's mission was cancelled and he returned to base, everything felt off. His comrades, the ones who'd wished him farewell, were gone. New faces replaced them, with the same blank stares and trembling hands. Everyone was dying in sequence. He had escaped the rotation, for now. But instead of being treated like a lucky man, he was avoided. Like his survival was shameful. Like he had broken some sacred pact. The culture didn't celebrate the living. It only immortalized the dead. Hayashi walked through the barracks and saw the empty beds. Some still had folded letters on the pillows. Others had photos of girlfriends tucked beneath uniforms that would never be worn again. Every time a plane left, it didn't come back, he said. The silence afterward was the loudest sound I've ever heard. He watched new recruits arrive, nervously smiling, shaking, trying to be brave. Some were even younger than him, and he realized something terrifying. The system never stopped. It needed more boys, more letters, more deaths. The war machine kept going, even if the war was already lost. He began to feel something he couldn't shake. Guilt. Why him? Why did he get to live? He had been ready. He had accepted death. Now he had to accept something harder, that he would carry the weight of those who didn't return. Hayashi didn't talk about this for decades, not until Japan had changed, not until the myths started to crack. Only then did he speak, not as a hero, but as a broken survivor of a death cult that disguised itself as patriotism. After the war ended, Fujio Hayashi returned home to a Japan in ruins, cities bombed, people starving, and a generation spiritually broken. But for men like Hayashi, the damage wasn't just physical, it was personal. He came back not as a hero, but as a reminder of something the country didn't want to face. That their war effort had included sacrificing boys in a suicide machine that didn't even win the war. The truth was, survivors of the kamikaze program weren't welcomed. They were often ignored, ridiculed, or forgotten. The government no longer praised them. Families who had received letters and relics from fallen sons were treated with reverence. But Hayashi? He was an uncomfortable relic of a failed ideology. "I thought I would be celebrated for being willing to die," he later said. "Instead, I was treated like I had dishonored the dead." Some kamikaze survivors were branded cowards. Others remained silent for decades, fearing judgment. Many never told their own children the truth. The government made efforts to suppress interviews or memoirs that criticized the imperial order. They wanted to preserve the myth of glory, not confront the reality of psychological manipulation. Hayashi suffered in silence. He lived in a small town, took up work in a factory, and rarely spoke about what had happened. But inside, the guilt festered. He had trained to die. He had written his last words. And now he had to live with the fact that his survival made him invisible in the eyes of a nation obsessed with death as virtue. Worse still, he wasn't alone. There were hundreds like him, kamikaze pilots whose missions were delayed, canceled, or rerouted. Some had mechanical failures, others were reassigned, but none of them fit into Japan's post-war narrative of martyrdom. And so they were left out of the story, until some of them decided to speak. For decades, Japan preserved and displayed letters written by kamikaze pilots in museums, often cherry-picked for patriotism. But when historians finally dug into the uncensored letters, a different picture emerged. One of fear, regret, and unimaginable pressure. One pilot wrote, "I cannot say I am brave. I do not wish to die. But if I refuse, what will become of my family?" Another confessed, "They told me I was lucky to be chosen. I wanted to run, but where would I go?" These weren't warriors driven by fanaticism. They were teenagers, students, poets, and sons, pushed into a system that gave them two options: die honorably or live in shame. Some kamikaze pilots wrote multiple farewell letters because their missions kept getting postponed. One man wrote 13 different goodbyes. Can you imagine writing your last words over and over, only to return each night and have to do it again? Fujio Hayashi's own letter was short and humble. "To my mother, I go now as a man of Japan. Please be proud. I'm sorry I couldn't be a better son." But he lived, and he carried that letter with him for the rest of his life, a piece of himself that had already died before the war ended. These letters became time bombs, waiting to explode the myth. Once exposed, they proved something Japan never wanted to admit: that kamikaze pilots weren't volunteers. They were victims of a culture that wrapped death in silk and called it honor. Hayashi would later reflect that he never truly believed in the glory. He simply feared the dishonor more. In the 1970s and 80s, Japan began a slow cultural shift, one that allowed veterans like Hayashi to finally speak. Documentaries started appearing. Historians published full, uncensored letters. Survivors told their stories, and the world was shocked. Fujio Hayashi agreed to a rare interview. His voice was quiet, his eyes distant. He didn't tell grand war stories. He didn't brag. He spoke about the silence that followed him for decades. "No one ever told us what we were really dying for," he said. "We were told we were gods. But I came home, and I was a ghost." He spoke of comrades who cried the night before their missions, of boys who tried to sabotage their own planes, of letters they burned so their families wouldn't feel ashamed. These were not the images Japan had immortalized. The kamikaze myth had always been simple: brave boys, willing hearts, divine sacrifice. But now it was clear that image had been carefully crafted by wartime propaganda. The real kamikaze pilots were scared, manipulated, and lied to. The idea of volunteering wasn't pure. In many cases, students were told to step forward in front of their peers, knowing full well what refusal meant. Others were given no choice at all. Hayashi's survival became more than a glitch in the narrative. It became a crack in the armor. And from that crack, the truth began to pour out. Fujio Hayashi may have survived the war, but a part of him never left that airstrip in 1945. For the rest of his life, he lived in quiet obscurity, working odd jobs, avoiding attention, and staying silent about his past. It wasn't until he was in his 60s that he began to open up, slowly, carefully, as if the words themselves might still betray him. He wasn't proud of surviving. He was ashamed. "I still ask myself, why did I live?" he once said. "Was my life worth more than theirs?" Each year, on the anniversary of his canceled mission, he would light incense, not for himself, but for the boys who never came back. He kept a small box of mementos, a folded farewell letter, an armband, and a photo of a friend who died the week after Hayashi's own flight was canceled. That friend's name was never recorded in any official war memorial. Hayashi told no one about the nightmares, the dreams where he was back in the cockpit, flying toward an American ship, hearing his heart pounding louder than the engine. He'd wake up in a sweat, breathless, still gripping his sheets like a control stick. And then came the worst part, the guilt that he had the luxury of waking up at all. He began writing his own account in a small notebook, not for publication, just to try and understand what he had survived. In one passage he wrote, "We believed dying was a way to become eternal, but it was living that haunted us." Hayashi's story was not unique. Survivors like him, maybe a few hundred in total, became walking contradictions in post-war Japan. They were supposed to be dead. Instead, they were ignored, shamed, or worse, forgotten. And yet, the weight they carried was heavier than any glory could ever be. Today, Japan officially remembers the kamikaze pilots as national heroes. Shrines are built in their honor. Museums display their belongings. But rarely, if ever, do these exhibits show the darker truth, the psychological manipulation, the coerced volunteering, the unfiltered final letters soaked in fear. Fujio Hayashi spent his final years trying to change that. He gave testimony to researchers, appeared in documentaries, and participated in interviews where he told the full, unpolished truth. He said Japan needed to stop romanticizing the kamikaze pilots as eager warriors. They were victims of a desperate military, of a collapsing empire, and of a culture that confused obedience with honor. "We didn't fly for glory," he said in one interview. "We flew because we were told to, because we didn't know how to say no." The government didn't respond. His story was quietly tolerated, but not amplified. And when school children are taught about the kamikaze today, it's still mostly the myth, not the man. Not the boy who survived, who cried, who came home, and who struggled to find meaning in a life he was never supposed to have. Even now, many Japanese officials avoid direct acknowledgement that the kamikaze program was a massive psychological campaign to turn young boys into fuel for a dying empire. But survivors like Hayashi make it impossible to forget, because they are the cracks in the story, the living proof that the narrative wasn't just flawed, it was fabricated. He paused, his voice trembled, and then he said, I'm sorry I lived, but I lived for you." He died quietly, in a small home surrounded by the few people who knew the full weight of his past. No grand military ceremony, no medals, just a man who had finally told the truth and then passed into history. But his words remain. His story, and the stories of others like him, have begun to reshape how we see the kamikaze pilots. Not as suicide bombers, not as mindless patriots, but as manipulated sons, caught in a system that demanded their lives in the name of a lie. Fujio Hayashi's survival was never a sign of weakness. It was a chance, a rare, painful, lonely chance, to tell the world what really happened. And now, that story is out. The photos of young pilots smiling before death, the letters soaked in ink and fear, the silent shame that haunted the ones who came back. All of it leads to one chilling conclusion. They weren't willing. They were chosen. And the only thing more tragic than their deaths was that the world believed they wanted to die. Somewhere in a forgotten attic, a dusty box sat sealed for over 80 years. Inside, dozens of never-before-seen photographs taken by German soldiers during the early days of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. These images aren't propaganda. They're raw, haunting, and brutally honest. Captured by the men themselves as they marched through Belarus and into the heart of the Soviet Union, these photos reveal a version of World War II rarely shown in textbooks. From scorched villages to quiet moments in war-torn fields, this is what the invasion really looked like, through the eyes of those who fought. And for the first time in decades, we are finally seeing the truth. Somewhere in an attic, inside a dusty, unmarked box, lay a roll of undeveloped film that hadn't seen daylight since the summer of 1941. No one had touched it in over 80 years. But when historians recently uncovered these photos, what they found shocked even the most seasoned experts. These weren't official propaganda pictures or military-posed portraits. They were personal, raw, and brutally honest glimpses into World War II, captured by the very German soldiers who lived it. The story begins with a private photo album, hidden away by a soldier from the Wehrmacht's 7th Panzer Division. Passed down quietly through family generations, no one realized the historical significance until a great-grandson donated it to a small museum in rural Germany. When archivists began scanning the negatives, they were stunned. The images revealed forgotten scenes of Operation Barbarossa, Germany's surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. These were not the usual dramatic shots of tanks rolling in triumph or perfectly organized columns. Instead, they showed war's quiet in-between moments. Soldiers resting in the grass, destroyed towns stripped of life, and faces, young, tired, sometimes smiling, caught in fleeting moments of calm before the storm. Unlike battlefield reports or staged newsreels, these photos hadn't been filtered through Nazi censors. They showed what the soldiers really saw: ordinary villages on fire, locals staring in fear, graves dug hurriedly by the roadside. Some images even had handwritten notes on the back, names, dates, places that had long been swallowed by history. In a world flooded with digital reconstructions and dramatized documentaries, this was something rare. Untouched truth. Why were these photos hidden for so long? Likely because of their content. Some showed German soldiers attending funerals, others captured the destruction of civilian homes, and one haunting shot showed an abandoned frying pan still hanging on a stove, the only remnant of a family who had fled or been killed. These weren't the kinds of images meant for public morale. They were never supposed to be seen. Until now. And what they show? is chilling. In June 1941, with Europe already under his heel, Adolf Hitler unleashed the largest military invasion in history. Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German soldiers surged across the Soviet border, backed by more than 3,000 tanks and thousands of aircraft. The Wehrmacht swept across Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltics with terrifying speed. Hitler believed that Stalin's Red Army would collapse like a house of cards within 6 weeks. At first, it seemed he was right. These newly uncovered photos capture that moment. The overconfidence, the energy, the belief in swift conquest. Tanks rolled down dirt roads. Villages were occupied with barely a shot fired. Soviet defenses crumbled in some regions. One photo shows a column of German flamethrower tanks, the Panzer II Flamingo, rumbling down a Belarusian road toward the front. In another, a German soldier crouches beside a roadside, binoculars in hand, peering into the vast Soviet landscape with a look of calm, maybe even excitement. But what's not visible in the early images is the storm gathering just beyond the trees. What these soldiers didn't know was that they weren't just invading a country. They were stepping into a war unlike anything they'd seen before. The Soviet Union was not Poland. It was not France. It was vast, rugged, and unrelenting. Soviet soldiers may have been under-equipped, but they were not unwilling. They fought bitterly, retreating only to regroup and strike back harder. Stalin issued scorched earth orders. Nothing was to be left behind. Entire towns were burned. Bridges were blown up to slow the German advance. Fields were poisoned. Wells collapsed. Railroads torn apart. Still, in these early weeks, the Germans pushed forward. They moved an average of 15 to 30 kilometers per day. The photos show soldiers riding horses, pushing bicycles, and marching on foot, not quite the motorized juggernaut we imagine. In fact, nearly 90% of the German army was made up of regular infantry units, not flashy panzer divisions. Supplies were carried by horse-drawn wagons, just like in the First World War. It's here that the illusion of modern, mechanized blitzkrieg begins to unravel. The invasion was powerful, yes, but it was also slow, muddy, and human. And as they advanced deeper into Soviet territory, the bodies began to pile up. What makes these photographs so unsettling is not what they show, but what they don't. There's no glory, no grand victory, no orchestrated triumph. Instead, we see young soldiers huddled in makeshift tents. Some are shirtless, washing their faces in tin basins. Others read German military newsletters like Der Panzerfaust, or sit quietly writing letters home. These aren't scenes of battle. They're fragments of daily survival. One particularly haunting image shows a German soldier asleep in the shade, helmet by his side, while another scans the horizon with rabbit ear binoculars. In another, two men peel potatoes beside a mountain of field gear. There's an odd quiet in these photos, the sense of a pause before something terrible. Even in occupied Belarusian villages, life seems strangely still. Local women thresh wheat, while German soldiers walk by with rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. Some villagers look on with blank expressions. Others seem to ignore the soldiers altogether, as if nothing can be done now. It's not all silent, though. There are strange, surreal moments caught on camera. In one, a stuffed bear, likely stolen from a museum, is tied to a lamppost in a town square. In another, a soldier stands in front of a statue of Vladimir Lenin, grinning as if on vacation. There's even a photo of a German military orchestra performing for troops in a makeshift field concert. The contrast between music and massacre couldn't be sharper. But not all the images are light. One photo shows a simple birch cross marked with a soldier's name, helmet resting on top. It's a battlefield grave. Rushed, unadorned, temporary. Another shows a scorched village with only stone stoves standing. A sight so common it became symbolic of the Eastern Front. The most gut-wrenching photo of all might be the one showing a frying pan hanging on a stove in the ruins of a house. The family that once used it? Gone. Dead. Or fled. These were the quiet casualties. Civilians caught in the flood of tanks and artillery. German soldiers may have seen themselves as warriors or even liberators. But through their own cameras, they revealed a different story. One of villages burned, lives uprooted, and a war machine far more fragile than it seemed. There's one photo in the album that haunts you long after you've looked away. It shows a small Belarusian village, or what's left of it. The buildings are scorched black, the windows shattered, the trees are stripped bare, and in the center of the frame, 3 stone chimneys remain upright. The only things left standing. This wasn't a battlefield. This was someone's home. The village was called November, and like countless others caught in the path of Germany's eastern invasion, it was obliterated during the summer of 1941. According to Soviet records and oral accounts, November had fewer than 200 residents when the Germans arrived. Most were elderly men, women, and children. The younger men had been conscripted just days before, pulled into Stalin's chaotic, last-minute mobilization as the Wehrmacht swept closer. When the Germans reached Nov, they found no soldiers, no fortifications, just civilians. But November was burned anyway. The photos reveal the aftermath. One shows a group of German soldiers walking their horses down the village's main street. Once lined with homes, now just piles of ash. In the background stands the shell of a church, its roof torn open. Interestingly, this church had already been shut down before the invasion. Soviet authorities had turned it into a garage, part of their campaign to eliminate religion. Now, both regimes had erased what little remained of the town's soul. We don't know who set the fire, but German field orders from that period were clear. If a village was suspected of harboring partisans, it was to be destroyed. No investigation, no trial. Burn it down. And yet, life clung on. One image captures a surreal town meeting in the ruins. A handful of German officers speak to the remaining villagers. Women stand in silence, clutching small sacks of grain. A few barefoot children peek from behind their mothers' skirts. These civilians now had to feed not only themselves, but also the foreign soldiers who had taken over their homes. You can see the weariness in their faces, and in the German soldiers too. This wasn't the easy victory they had been promised. The Blitzkrieg was slowing, the resistance was hardening, and the Eastern Front was just beginning to show its true face. History often paints the German war machine as this unstoppable, perfectly oiled engine of destruction. Tanks, half-tracks, motorized columns. But the reality captured in these photographs tells a different story. Germany's army, especially on the Eastern Front in 1941, was shockingly primitive. There's a photo of a German soldier peeling potatoes next to a wooden cart pulled by a horse. Another shows a group of infantrymen loading equipment onto bicycles. Not motorcycles, not trucks, but standard two-wheel bikes. Why? Because nearly 90% of Germany's divisions during Operation Barbarossa were not motorized. They relied on foot marches, wagons, and horse-drawn artillery just like in World War I. The images make it painfully clear. One shot shows a dusty column of men trudging along a narrow dirt road, their faces red with sweat, rifles slung over tired shoulders. Another captures a broken bridge, blown up by retreating Soviets, with German soldiers constructing a pontoon replacement. In the background, wrecked T-26 Soviet tanks lay smoldering in the weeds. Even when they advanced, the Germans had to build their own roads, replace bridges, and scavenge fuel from abandoned Soviet vehicles. This wasn't rapid conquest. It was a logistical nightmare. And the vehicles they did have? Many were prone to breakdowns in the heat and mud. There's a photo of a soldier bent over an open engine hatch, smoke curling from inside. The caption scribbled on the back reads, "She didn't make it." Another photo shows a Junkers Ju-88 bomber parked crookedly beside a field road. Its tail has been shredded by flak. The crew isn't celebrating a successful raid. They're huddled nearby, quiet. This wasn't the glamorous war Hitler promised. It wasn't even efficient. Soldiers were being ground down not by enemy fire, but by exhaustion, weather, and faulty equipment. It's a reminder that behind every myth of German superiority, there was mud, blood, and broken wheels. In the middle of a clearing, surrounded by pine trees and silence, stands a row of wooden crosses. Each one has a name scrawled across the plank. Helmets rest atop the graves. One has flowers, freshly picked. Another has a cigarette tucked into a crack in the wood. These aren't military cemeteries. These are field graves, temporary, improvised, and heartbreaking. The Wehrmacht lost tens of thousands of men in the first few months of Operation Barbarossa. Despite their early success, the cost was staggering. The photographs show these losses in brutal clarity. One image captures a small burial ceremony. A group of soldiers standing in a loose circle, heads bowed, one man playing a slow tune on a harmonica. There's no chaplain, no flag, just a grave in the dirt and a moment of silence before marching on. Another photo, labeled Vitebsk, July 1941, shows a German gravesite just outside a destroyed town. Rows of makeshift crosses stretch toward the tree line. These men had no idea their final resting place would be forgotten, eventually overrun as the Soviet counteroffensive pushed the Germans back in the years ahead. Many of these graves were never relocated. Their bones still lie beneath the soil, beneath Belarusian farmland, lost to time. What's eerie is that these photos weren't meant to be morbid. At the time, the soldiers taking them likely saw the graves as symbols of honor. Fallen comrades remembered, heroes who had given their lives for the fatherland. Some photos even show soldiers saluting the dead or scribbling notes into journals beside the burial mounds. But history adds context. These weren't just graves. They were markers of Germany's overconfidence, evidence that the easy invasion was already unraveling. Every cross told a story not just of death, but of delusion. The myth of invincibility was being buried, one soldier at a time. And the worst was yet to come. Not every image from this haunting collection shows fire and ruin. In fact, some of the most chilling are the ones where the war seems absent. In one photograph, German soldiers are lounging under a tree, shirts off, laughing over a can of soup. Another shows a group peeling potatoes with their rifles propped up behind them. One soldier has a cigarette tucked behind his ear and is reading a propaganda newsletter called Der Panzerfaust, the tank fist. They look like young men at summer camp, except they're deep inside enemy territory, and the next photo shows burned houses on the horizon. This bizarre contrast between the mundanity of life and the horror of death runs through the entire album. There's a picture of a soldier writing a letter to his mother. He's barefoot, wearing only underwear, resting on a wool blanket next to his machine gun. Another frame captures a field concert, with an impromptu orchestra playing for soldiers who sit cross-legged in the grass. One of them holds a camera instead of a rifle. These quiet moments feel surreal when you realize what surrounded them. In the very next image, the same troops are shown marching through scorched Belarusian villages. Women thresh wheat in the distance, while their children stare hollow-eyed at the camera. The Wehrmacht had taken their homes, and now the same soldiers were asking for bread and water. This illusion of normalcy was a vital tool for the German army. Daily routines, letters, music, and humor were coping mechanisms. They made the brutal invasion feel bearable. They gave the illusion that what they were doing was civilized, that it was part of some grand mission, not a mass invasion and occupation. But the quiet didn't last. The Soviet resistance was growing. Partisan activity was on the rise, and the soldiers who once lounged under trees would soon be sleeping in snow-covered trenches, with frost-bitten fingers wrapped around rusted weapons. By the winter of 1941, many of the men in these photos would either be dead or dying. Their summer lullabies would be replaced by artillery blasts echoing through frozen forests. By late 1941, the cracks in the German war machine were no longer subtle. The lightning speed of the initial invasion, the Blitzkrieg, had sputtered. Soviet resistance wasn't breaking. It was hardening. The Wehrmacht was bleeding. The photos start to change. Earlier in the album, there are neat rows of panzer tanks, half-tracks, and supply convoys. Later, those scenes are replaced with wreckage, abandoned vehicles, burned-out trucks, horses scavenging in destroyed supply dumps. In one image, you see soldiers trying to dig a tank out of thick Belarusian mud. Their expressions are no longer confident. They're frustrated, exhausted. One man looks directly into the lens, his face caked in dirt. The illusion is breaking. The weather turned on them, too. Summer gave way to early frosts. The German army was not equipped for Russian winters. Thin boots, no antifreeze, limited fuel. In one image, soldiers are huddled around a fire, their breath visible in the morning air. Another shows a field kitchen frozen solid. But perhaps the most damning photo of all is the one with a map. A German officer studies it while sitting on a supply crate. His compass rests on his knee. The caption, "Still moving, but where to?" That question haunted the entire Eastern campaign. Because it wasn't just geography that trapped the Germans, it was arrogance. The plan, to take Moscow in 10 weeks, was based on faulty assumptions. They thought the Soviet Union would collapse like France. But the Soviets weren't just retreating. They were preparing, drawing them in, waiting for winter. The psychological weight began to show. More graves, more empty eyes, fewer smiles. Even the propaganda photos begin to feel strained, as if trying to cover up something unraveling. The myth of German dominance was fading, replaced by something more human and terrifying: desperation. The last pages of the photo collection don't show battles. They show graves. You see a clearing in the woods, a dozen crosses, some labeled, some anonymous. A birch tree leans nearby, scarred by bullet holes. One grave has a helmet perched on top. Another has a cigarette box wedged into the dirt. These aren't dramatic war memorials. They're temporary, rushed, a way to say goodbye without any guarantee that the body would ever be found again. And they weren't. Most of the soldiers buried here never made it home. As the Soviet counteroffensive roared to life in late 1941 and early 1942, the German lines collapsed. Entire divisions vanished. One of the units featured in the photos, the 219th Infantry Division, lost over 10,000 men by the end of that winter. By March 1943, fewer than 1,200 remained. The rest were gone. The graves were left behind, swallowed by forests, buried by snowfall, erased by time. It's here that the story of this photo album truly ends. Not in glory, not in triumph, but in silence. These soldiers believed they would win, that they would return as heroes, but they became shadows instead. Bones under farmland, names on rusted dog tags, forgotten by all but the ghosts of war. And now, 80 years later, their images resurface. Raw, human, and deeply flawed. Some of these men believed they were on the right side. Others simply followed orders. Some were killers. Others were kids. The truth doesn't offer redemption, but it does offer context. And that's what these photographs do. They remind us that history isn't a headline or a textbook summary. It's real, it's messy, and it's written in the eyes of the people who were there, many of whom never got to leave. It was the gun that tore through the icy battlefields of the Eastern Front, lightweight, brutally fast, and impossible to ignore. The PPSH-41 wasn't just a submachine gun. It was Stalin's answer to Germany's firepower. With a drum magazine that held 71 rounds and a rate of fire so rapid it sounded like ripping cloth, the PPSH-41 transformed entire battles. Soviet soldiers didn't just carry it, they swarmed with it, overwhelming enemies with sheer volume. And while it looked simple, there was genius buried in that stamped metal frame. So how did the PPSH-41 become the backbone of the Red Army during World War II? Why did it remain in use long after the war, across countries and continents, from Korea to Vietnam to modern-day rebel conflicts? In this video, we'll uncover the full truth, how it was made, how it worked, and why even today, the PPSH-41 still earns respect from weapons experts around the world. What you're about to hear is the untold story of the gun that changed history, one blazing burst at a time. The story of the PPSH-41 doesn't begin on a battlefield. It begins in desperation. In 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, sending millions of troops crashing into Soviet territory. The Red Army was completely unprepared. Their infantry was outgunned, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed. German troops were equipped with the deadly MG-34 and MP-40, weapons that gave them unmatched firepower in mobile warfare. Soviet soldiers, by contrast, were still using outdated bolt-action Mosin-Nagant rifles and the unreliable PPD-40 submachine gun. The PPD was expensive to produce, required skilled labor, and broke down easily under battlefield stress. Stalin's generals knew they needed something better, and fast. The solution came from a relatively unknown Soviet weapons designer named Georgy Shpagin. He proposed a submachine gun that was simple, cost-effective, and brutally efficient. The design emphasized stamped metal parts over machined ones, dramatically cutting down manufacturing time. Even the wood stock could be crudely formed. His goal was to create a weapon that could be mass-produced by unskilled labor in factories evacuated east of the Urals, far from the advancing German lines. The prototype was rushed through testing and approved by Stalin himself, who saw it as essential to saving the Red Army from collapse. Production began before the ink was dry on the final design documents. By late 1941, the weapon was officially designated the PPSH-41. It fired the powerful 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev round, a cartridge with exceptional velocity and penetration, and used a drum magazine capable of holding 71 rounds. When the Red Army issued the first batches to frontline troops, they knew immediately this wasn't just another gun. It was a turning point. The PPSH-41 wasn't elegant, it was raw. But it was that brutal simplicity that made it so powerful. It was made primarily of stamped steel, which meant parts could be pressed into shape rather than carved or milled. In wartime conditions, that wasn't just efficient, it was revolutionary. Each PPSH-41 could be built in just a few hours by workers who had no experience with weapons manufacturing. And in Stalin's war machine, that meant everything. The gun used a blowback action and was open bolt, which meant that every time a round was fired, the bolt stayed open, ready to slam forward again. It had no selector switch. It was full auto only. That meant when you pulled the trigger, the PPSH-41 unleashed a blinding storm of bullets at a staggering 900 to 1,000 rounds per minute. That rate of fire gave it its terrifying nickname, the burp gun. On the battlefield, it sounded like tearing fabric. To the Germans, it was the sound of death. But firepower wasn't the only advantage. The PPSH-41 had range. Thanks to the high-velocity Tokarev round, it could hit targets up to 150 meters away with accuracy. That was nearly double what most submachine guns could manage at the time. The weapon was also praised for its reliability. In the mud, snow, and frozen wastelands of the Eastern Front, it kept working long after other weapons jammed or froze. German soldiers often ditched their MP-40s and picked up PPSH-41s from fallen Soviets whenever they had the chance. That alone speaks volumes. Perhaps the most iconic feature of the PPSH-41 was its massive drum magazine. With 71 rounds, a single soldier could unleash a continuous stream of bullets without reloading. In the chaos of trench raids and urban combat, that was a game-changer. There was also a 35-round stick magazine option, preferred by some troops because it was easier to reload and more reliable. But nothing matched the psychological impact of the full drum. A single man with a PPSH-41 could pin down an entire squad if used correctly. It gave Soviet infantry the edge they needed to turn the tide. The Red Army didn't just hand out the PPSH-41 and hope for the best, they built entire tactics around it. Infantry squads were restructured to maximize the weapon's power. A typical Soviet squad in 1942 might have 2 or 3 men armed with PPSH-41s, supporting the rest of the riflemen. But by 1943, entire units were being armed almost exclusively with the PPSH-41. In some cases, whole battalions stormed German lines, wielding nothing but submachine guns. It was overwhelming, noisy, terrifying. The Soviets understood that war on the Eastern Front was often fought at close range, in forests, ruins, and trenches. That's where the PPSH-41 thrived. It wasn't a long-distance marksman's tool, it was designed for closing the distance fast and breaking through enemy positions with a wave of lead. When paired with shock tactics, smoke, grenades, and raw aggression, the PPSH-41 gave Soviet troops the ability to swarm and overwhelm enemy defenses in minutes. One famous tactic was the night raid. Under cover of darkness, Soviet troops would sneak close to German lines, then rush in at dawn, screaming with bayonets and PPSH-41s blazing. The goal wasn't subtlety, it was psychological warfare. Entire German outposts were overrun in minutes. Some defenders simply broke and ran, unable to withstand the sudden wall of fire. Soviet commanders also trained their troops to conserve ammo by firing in short bursts. Despite its huge magazine, the PPSH-41's rate of fire could empty it in under 5 seconds. Discipline mattered. A well-trained soldier could suppress multiple enemies and still have rounds left, to defend his position. As the war progressed, Soviet production increased. By 1945, over 6 million units had been manufactured, and the Red Army was no longer under-equipped. They were now the best-equipped infantry in the war when it came to close-quarters firepower. The PPSH-41 didn't just dominate the battlefield with bullets, it broke morale. German infantry units reported a specific kind of fear when they encountered Soviet troops armed with it. It wasn't just about firepower, it was the noise. The PPSH-41's rapid rate of fire didn't sound like conventional gunfire, it sounded like a mechanical scream. That high-pitched, rapid-fire burp echoed across frozen forests and ruined cities, warning enemy troops that a Soviet assault was moments away. In close-quarters fighting, the gun's presence changed everything. Rooms were cleared in seconds. Trenches were overrun in minutes. Its massive drum magazine gave Soviet soldiers a terrifying edge in suppressive fire. Most submachine guns of the era, like the German MP-40, only held 32 rounds. The PPSH-41 had more than double that, and it could fire it faster. That kind of sustained output was psychologically devastating in an ambush or tight combat scenario. Even in defense, the PPSH-41 made a statement. During the brutal battles of Stalingrad and Leningrad, where entire blocks were fought over one building at a time, Soviet soldiers used the weapon to devastating effect. They'd set up ambush points inside buildings, behind rubble, or in sewers. When German troops advanced, the PPSH-41 came alive, unloading in short, ruthless bursts. The Germans called it Die Nähmaschine, or the sewing machine, for its sound. But unlike a sewing machine, it stitched death. Captured German diaries described entire platoons halted in fear by one man firing from cover with a PPSH-41. Its sound alone became enough to make officers second-guess assaults. It wasn't precision that gave the gun its reputation, it was volume. The psychological warfare it waged was nearly as powerful as the physical destruction it caused. And that fear wasn't just limited to German troops. Even within the Red Army, soldiers respected the gun as an extension of their power, a symbol of the Soviet ability to strike back. The PPSH-41 was a Soviet weapon, but ironically, it was also one of the most used German weapons of the war. That's not a joke. German troops captured so many PPSH-41s from the battlefield, especially after Stalingrad, that they started issuing them to their own men. Whole divisions on the Eastern Front were equipped with captured versions. In fact, the Wehrmacht even produced its own 9mm conversion kits to allow the use of German ammunition in the PPSH-41. They renamed it the MP-717R and treated it as official military gear. Why? Because it worked. Even the enemy couldn't deny its effectiveness. The PPSH-41 was simple to use, reliable in brutal conditions, and unmatched in volume of fire. German soldiers respected it so much that they'd pick it up off the battlefield, rather than stick with their issued MP-40. In some divisions, commanders actively sought out PPSH-41s to better prepare for Soviet-style urban warfare. Think about that. A Soviet weapon was so effective that the Nazis willingly armed their own men with it. Back on the Soviet side, adaptability was key. Factories across the Soviet Union modified the gun depending on regional needs. In the harsh winter conditions of the Eastern Front, versions with insulated trigger groups were produced so soldiers could fire it with gloves on. Some were painted white for winter camouflage. Others were adjusted to fit better on tanks, aircraft, and naval vessels. But the biggest field modification was always the magazine. While the 71-round drum was iconic, it wasn't perfect. It rattled, it was heavy, and early versions had feeding issues. So Soviet troops often modified their PPSH-41s to accept the 35-round stick magazine instead. This made it lighter, easier to reload, and more reliable in sustained combat. In elite units, like the Soviet Naval Infantry or reconnaissance squads, this version became the standard. This adaptability is what helped the PPSH-41 stay in frontline use for decades after World War II. Even when newer weapons came out, soldiers often chose to keep it. It was trusted, it was battle-proven, and it never failed them when things got ugly. By 1944, the Red Army was no longer defending its homeland. It was advancing. As they pushed west through Ukraine, Poland, and into Germany, the PPSH-41 became the centerpiece of Soviet assault tactics. It was especially suited to urban warfare. In bombed-out buildings, narrow alleyways, and subway tunnels, the gun was unmatched. It didn't require precise aiming. It required volume and violence, and it delivered both. Soviet troops often worked in pairs during building sweeps. One soldier kicked down doors or tossed grenades, and the other cleared the room with a PPSH-41. That room-clearing method became standard doctrine for years to come and influenced post-war military tactics across the globe. NATO and Warsaw Pact forces both took notes. The idea of suppressive fire in enclosed spaces became fundamental, and it all came from how the Soviets used the PPSH-41. After the war ended, the gun didn't fade away. It spread. The Soviet Union shipped thousands of PPSH-41s to allies and satellite states across the globe. It saw action in Korea, where North Korean and Chinese troops used it to great effect against UN forces. American troops, armed mostly with M1 Garands and carbines, were stunned by the sheer volume of lead coming from PPSH-41 squads. It forced U.S. commanders to reevaluate how they approached close-range engagements. The gun appeared again in Vietnam, used by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army. In thick jungle and tight ambush situations, the PPSH-41 reigned supreme once again. Its sound was feared. Its silhouette became familiar. It was the gun of revolution, resistance, and asymmetric warfare. And that's just scratching the surface. From Africa to the Middle East, Latin America to the Balkans, the PPSH-41 became the weapon of the underdog. Guerrilla movements, liberation armies, and insurgents adopted it. Why? Because it was cheap, reliable, easy to maintain. And when the shooting started, it could outgun almost anything. The PPSH-41 wasn't just a Soviet invention, it was a global phenomenon. It proved that with the right design, even a hastily built, ugly industrial machine could change the course of history. One of the most defining characteristics of the PPSH-41 was how effective it became in urban environments. During the brutal house-to-house fighting in places like Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Berlin, the PPSH-41 turned into an almost mythic weapon for Soviet troops. Its compact size and extreme rate of fire made it ideal for close-quarters battle, where engagement distances were often measured in feet rather than yards. In the tight hallways of bombed-out buildings or the trenches carved through rubble, soldiers didn't need long-range rifles. They needed overwhelming firepower at short range, and the PPSH-41 delivered. The design was so efficient in this type of warfare that entire Soviet platoons would sometimes be outfitted with nothing but the PPSH-41. This created a kind of mobile storm squad that could lay down a storm of bullets in seconds, flooding enemy positions with a wall of lead. German troops who faced Soviet forces in the cities feared the sound of the PPSH-41 more than almost anything else. One Wehrmacht soldier wrote in a letter that the rattling of the Russian drum gun in the distance was a warning. They were coming close, and they were coming fast. Its effectiveness led to changes in German tactics. German troops tried to avoid street fighting with Soviet units that were heavily armed with PPSH-41s unless they had superior numbers or tank support. In many reports, they spoke of being pinned down by just a handful of Soviet soldiers equipped with the gun. The psychological effect was just as powerful as the physical one. The drum magazine, spitting out 900 rounds per minute, sounded like a buzzsaw, a terrifying audio cue that meant instant death if you were caught in its path. Soviet generals began forming specialized units that used the PPSH-41 almost exclusively. These shock troops became experts in room clearing, ambushing, and rapid flanking attacks. Their job was to break through fortified positions and clear buildings street by street, floor by floor. Without the PPSH-41, it's likely the Red Army would have had a much harder time taking back the devastated cities of the Soviet Union. Even after World War II ended, the PPSH-41 didn't disappear. In fact, it began a second life in post-war conflicts around the world. The Soviet Union had manufactured millions of units, and many of them were distributed to allied nations and revolutionary groups. From China to North Korea to Vietnam, and even parts of Africa, the PPSH-41 showed up wherever communist movements or Soviet-supported forces were active. During the Korean War, North Korean and Chinese soldiers used the PPSH-41 in large numbers. American troops reported that the weapon's high rate of fire made nighttime engagements especially dangerous. In some cases, American infantry found themselves outgunned in close-range ambushes, where the M1 Garand simply couldn't compete with the sheer volume of bullets a PPSH-41 could unleash in a few seconds. Entire U.S. squads were pinned down by one or two PPSH-41s in the right terrain. It was in Korea that American military analysts started seriously re-evaluating their assumptions about what constituted superior firepower. In Vietnam, both the Viet Minh and later the Viet Cong used the PPSH-41 against French, South Vietnamese, and U.S. troops. Its rugged design made it ideal for the jungles of Southeast Asia. Even with limited access to spare parts, the gun could keep working with minimal care. Some versions were modified to accept AK-47 magazines or other locally sourced parts. These improvised hybrid weapons were a testament to the gun's versatility and enduring design. Decades after it was originally built, the PPSH-41 remained a weapon of choice for guerrilla fighters and insurgent forces. Its low production cost, combined with its ease of use and devastating firepower, ensured it remained relevant far longer than most military planners expected. In some African conflicts during the 1980s and 1990s, the PPSH-41 was still showing up in battlefield photos, almost 50 years after it was first issued to Soviet troops. So what is it about the PPSH-41 that gives it such legendary status, even 80 years later? Part of it is the sheer practicality of its design. In an age of precision-guided missiles and digital targeting systems, the PPSH-41 reminds us that sometimes simplicity wins. It didn't need advanced optics or polymer frames. It just needed to fire quickly, hold a lot of ammunition, and not break down in the mud, snow, or heat of battle. But it's more than just its technical features. The PPSH-41 came to symbolize something larger, the resourcefulness of a nation under siege. It was forged during one of the darkest periods of human history and became the voice of resistance, grit, and survival. Its very existence told a story that a simple, rugged tool in the hands of determined people could turn the tide of a war. Today, the PPSH-41 is a collector's item, a museum piece, and a historical icon. In reenactments, films, and documentaries, it still roars to life, representing the thunderous pace of Soviet infantry during the war. It's no exaggeration to say that this weapon helped win a world war. And unlike many of its contemporaries, it still has a presence, not just in old armories, but in the minds of those who study history, warfare, and survival. Its DNA can even be found in the designs of modern submachine guns. The idea that a single weapon could be mass-produced, simple to train with, reliable in combat, and devastating at close range became a standard. While newer firearms have replaced it in modern arsenals, the PPSH-41's spirit lives on in every lightweight, high-capacity firearm carried by soldiers today. It's not just a gun, it's a legacy. One forged in steel, tempered by war, and carried forward by the echo of every round fired in defense of something greater. They called it a Ronson because it lit on the first strike. To the men who rode into battle in Sherman tanks during World War II, that nickname wasn't a joke. It was a death sentence. While the M4 Sherman was fast, reliable, and cheap to produce, it was also a coffin on treads. Its thin armor and high profile made it an easy target. Its gun couldn't match the power of German Tigers or Panthers. And when it was hit, God help the crew inside. The smell of burning flesh, the screams of brothers trapped in molten steel. These were not rare tragedies. They were routine. And yet, thousands of young Americans rolled into hell inside those machines, knowing they had a worse chance of survival than the infantry walking beside them. This is not just the story of a flawed war machine. This is the story of the men who were told it would protect them, and then burned alive in it. Today, we're opening the hatch to a dark truth. Why Sherman tank crews were basically sentenced to death. The M4 Sherman was sold as a miracle of modern warfare. It was cheap, fast, and easy to mass produce. Designed in the early 1940s, it represented America's answer to armored combat. The military brass promised it would dominate the battlefield, but that promise would turn to ash for the thousands of young men sealed inside it. From the outside, the Sherman looked like a beast, measuring nearly 20 feet long, with a 75mm main gun and up to 5 crew members operating in tight synchronization. It could hit 30 miles per hour and was famously reliable. But here's the chilling truth. That reliability came at a deadly cost. In the rush to pump out tanks by the thousands, U.S. engineers prioritized quantity over survivability. German tanks like the Tiger and Panther were designed to kill. Shermans were designed to roll off the factory line. Former Sherman crewman Belton Y. Cooper described it plainly. We lost 648 tanks in combat, but the Germans only lost about 100 in the same time period. You tell me who had the better tank. The Sherman's armor was a joke to the 88mm cannons mounted on German machines. American doctrine emphasized mobility and flanking. But what happens when there's no room to flank and the enemy sees you first? The turret ring was weak. The armor was only 50mm thick in many areas. Ammunition was stored along the sides of the hull, unprotected. And the gasoline engine, unlike the diesel engines of Soviet tanks, turned every Sherman into a rolling fireball when struck. The crews knew this. They felt it. Every time the engine roared to life, they knew they might be climbing into their own crematorium. Still, the U.S. Army insisted the Sherman was good enough that it would win through numbers. That it didn't need to be the best, just better than nothing. But try telling that to a 19-year-old gunner watching his best friend get vaporized in the turret next to him. When the Allied forces landed at Normandy on D-Day, the Sherman was front and center. Over 1,500 rolled ashore in the first waves. They were meant to spearhead the breakout, but as soon as the first Shermans creaked off the Higgins boats and onto the beaches, the myth unraveled. German bunkers, anti-tank guns, minefields. The terrain of Normandy was a nightmare for armor. And in the hedgerows of the French countryside, Sherman tanks were sitting ducks. Thick vegetation and narrow roads gave German Panthers the upper hand, letting them ambush U.S. tanks with devastating precision. Crews had to improvise, welding metal rhino tusks onto the front of their tanks to plow through the hedgerows. But it wasn't enough. German 88mm shells tore through Sherman armor like it was paper. One hit was all it took. Flames erupted instantly. Men screamed. Some died instantly. Others weren't so lucky. In a 1944 letter home, one crewman wrote, "We found a Sherman yesterday, the hatch blown open. Inside were just bones, charred black. I don't know their names, but I know what their last minutes were like." And that's enough. Even when Shermans outnumbered the enemy 5-1, the kill ratio was often reversed. It took 5 or 6 Shermans to take down a single Tiger tank, and often 3 of those would be burning before the German beast was even scratched. The Germans called it Tommy Cookers, a cruel nickname implying the tank roasted its British and American crews like meat. And yet, the orders kept coming. Keep advancing. Keep pushing. Commanders told crews not to worry. Air support would even the odds. But in the thick hedgerows, air power was useless. It was steel versus steel. And the Sherman lost. Repeatedly. To understand why Sherman crews were basically sentenced to death, you have to understand the inside of the tank. Cramped, hot, deafening. The space was so tight that a tall man could barely move. The gunner's seat was like a metal coffin. And once the hatches were sealed, there was no easy way out. The interior was lined with ammunition, shells stored along the sides, underfoot, and behind seats. There was no blast shielding. One hit from a Panzer or Tiger, and the Sherman exploded from the inside. Ammunition cooked off in a chain reaction, engulfing everything in a matter of seconds. Veteran tank gunner Frank J. Levesque recalled, "When we got hit, it sounded like God had slammed a sledgehammer against a steel drum. Fire burst everywhere. I remember the driver screaming, just screaming. Then, nothing. Escape was nearly impossible. Hatches jammed from impact. Flames consumed oxygen. And if the explosion didn't kill you, the smoke did. Crews were taught to button up, stay sealed in to avoid small arms fire. But when your tank is on fire, those same hatches become your death trap. It wasn't just combat that endangered them. Mechanical failure, friendly fire, mines, all constant threats. Crews lived in constant fear. Their nerves frayed. They were trained to trust the machine, but deep down, they knew it would betray them the moment it was tested. Some crews went as far as to line the inside of their tanks with sandbags, desperately trying to add some kind of improvised protection. Others stored their ammo in different spots, hoping to delay a fatal fire just long enough to escape. The truth is, Sherman crews weren't just fighting the Germans. They were fighting their own equipment. And that's a battle no soldier should ever have to fight. The German Tiger I tank was a nightmare made real. Weighing over 60 tons, its 88mm cannon could pierce a Sherman from over 2,000 meters, well beyond the Sherman's effective firing range. Where the Sherman's shot might bounce harmlessly off the Tiger's thick front plate, the Tiger could obliterate its target in a single, thunderous strike. This wasn't theoretical. This was mathematics. Cold, calculated odds of survival. Or, more accurately, of destruction. The Tiger was engineered for dominance. Its firepower, armor, and optics far surpassed the Sherman's capabilities. And the Germans knew it. In one of the war's most damning assessments, German tank ace Michael Wittmann single-handedly destroyed an entire column of Shermans and other vehicles at Villers-Bocage in June 1944. The British Shermans never had a chance. They were lined up like tin ducks at a carnival. One by one, they were lit up. Flames, explosions, bodies thrown from hatches. All by one Tiger. In response, American doctrine pivoted. Instead of fighting the Tiger directly, they swarmed it. 5 or 6 Shermans might charge one Tiger, hoping to distract it long enough for a side shot. That was the strategy. Not better armor. Not a better gun. Just more men willing to die. And it wasn't just the Tiger. The Panther, lighter, faster, but almost as deadly, was more common. It carried a high-velocity 75mm gun that easily shredded Sherman armor. The Panther's sloped armor deflected incoming fire, while the Sherman's boxy shape invited penetrations. In a grim twist of irony, some of the most effective tank killing in Europe wasn't even done by tanks. It was German anti-tank guns like the Pak-40, which could punch through Shermans like butter. One U.S. commander said, "Our tanks are like glass, beautiful to look at, but once hit, they shatter." To many Sherman crews, encountering a Tiger or Panther didn't mean a tough fight. It meant you were going to die. The lucky ones might get out in time. The unlucky ones would vanish in fire and steel. It's hard to describe what it was like to be inside a Sherman when it got hit, because most who lived through it don't talk about it, and many who didn't never had the chance. When a Sherman was struck by a high-velocity shell, the result wasn't always an instant kill. Sometimes it meant a slow burn. Flames creeping across the floor, melting uniforms, cooking flesh. Smoke filled every inch of space in seconds. There was no fresh air, no light, just noise, chaos, and pain. Former driver Joseph Barrel once described how a nearby Sherman was hit. "I saw the turret lid pop open like a jack-in-the-box and flames shot out. A man tried to crawl out, but he was already on fire. He never made it." Inside the tank, the heat could reach over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Ammunition exploded in secondary detonations. Shrapnel ricocheted inside like a blender. If you weren't killed by the initial blast, the fire took you. If not the fire, then the smoke. And if you managed to open a hatch, if it wasn't jammed or blown off, you had to escape through a tiny opening, all while the tank burned beneath you and bullets screamed overhead. Crews knew this. They heard the stories. They saw the aftermath. And they still climbed inside, day after day. Some wrote goodbye letters and kept them folded in their breast pockets. Others made pacts with crewmates. "If one of us burns, shoot us before we scream." The military tried to adapt. Later models of the Sherman included wet stowage for ammunition, surrounding shells with water jackets to reduce the chance of a fire. It helped, but only a little. By the time those modifications were widespread, thousands had already died. These weren't just tankers. They were boys, farm kids, mechanics, draftees. They didn't sign up to be martyrs. But inside a Sherman, that's what they became. The tragedy of the Sherman isn't just mechanical, it's moral. Because the people at the top knew. They knew how vulnerable these tanks were. They had the statistics. They read the after-action reports. And still, the orders came. American tank doctrine at the time was built on flawed assumptions. One was that tanks shouldn't fight other tanks. That was the job of tank destroyers. So the Sherman was built to support infantry, not to take on Panthers or Tigers. But war doesn't follow doctrines. And in France, Belgium, and Germany, Shermans did face enemy armor, constantly. And they died in droves. The High Command, rather than redesign the tank or halt its deployment, doubled down. Why? Because the Sherman was cheap, easy to build, Henry Ford's assembly lines could churn them out faster than German factories could build a single Tiger. It was a war of attrition, and Sherman crews were the fuel. Even General George Patton, a famed tank commander himself, once wrote in his diary, "The Sherman is inferior. We must make better." But better never came, not in time. Crews were told to rely on numbers, flanking, and air support. But what they needed was protection, and they didn't get it. It wasn't until late in the war that American forces deployed the M-26 Pershing, finally a tank that could match German armor. But by then, the worst was over, and the blood price had already been paid. A quiet resentment grew among some crews. They didn't hate their officers, but they questioned why they were always sent forward first, into the meat grinder. Why their tanks lit up like torches while the enemies didn't. Why their friends never came back. But the brass kept smiling. These were boys fighting for freedom, told they were heroes, while being marched into hell inside a machine they knew wouldn't save them. For those who survived riding in the Sherman, the war didn't end when the gunfire stopped. Because the real wounds weren't always visible. Survivors carried trauma that no medal or parade could ever fix. Men came home with skin grafts over their faces, missing limbs, and lungs permanently scarred by smoke inhalation. But worse than the injuries were the memories. One crewman, Melvin Biddle, recalled, "You don't forget the smell. It's not like burning wood or fuel. It's human. And it gets inside you. You smell it in your sleep. You carry it forever." The horror of watching friends burn alive, of hearing screams echoing in a steel box, of scrambling for a jammed hatch while the floor beneath you melts. All of that got buried deep inside, and nobody back home wanted to hear about it. In post-war America, Sherman tankers were often overlooked. There were no blockbuster movies about their sacrifice, no statues in town squares. Infantry got recognition. Fighter pilots became legends. But the tankers? They were the ones who died before they could become heroes. Many drank. Many took jobs where they never had to hear loud noises again. Some never talked about the war at all, because to speak it out loud was to relive it. And for men like these, men who had been sealed in burning coffins, reliving it was too much to bear. Wives described them as distant. Sons remembered them as silent. It wasn't until decades later that PTSD was even understood. By then, most of the men who had climbed into Shermans during World War II had already buried the truth, along with too many of their friends. The Sherman didn't just kill men, it left survivors haunted by the way they lived. For every tanker who made it home, there was a memory burned into their mind that would never leave. They had walked away from death, but they carried it with them. The U.S. military's greatest defense of the Sherman was its numbers. American factories produced over 49,000 M4 Shermans during the war. That's more than double what Germany produced in all tank models combined. The logic was simple. We don't need the best, we just need more. And on paper, it worked. The Allies won. The Nazis were defeated. But at what cost? This strategy came with a brutal consequence. Human life became expendable. The math was clear. If it takes 5 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger, and 3 get destroyed in the process, the U.S. could absorb that loss. But that meant sending 3 crews to certain death just to earn a slim tactical gain. These weren't numbers. They were lives, faces, families. Some veterans saw through the lie. In his memoir, tanker Richard Riley wrote, "They told us we were winning. But I kept wondering, if we're winning, why are we always the ones dying first?" The belief that American industrial might would carry the day led to a moral blind spot. We built Shermans not to save lives, but to end the war faster. And in doing so, we sentenced thousands of young Americans to die inside a machine their own commanders knew was inferior. The war planners knew the armor was weak. They knew the gun was outdated. They knew the gasoline engine turned it into a fire hazard. But they built it anyway. And not once, tens of thousands of times. What's worse, the Sherman became a symbol of victory in the eyes of history. It appeared in newsreels, sitting triumphantly on German soil. It was hailed as a hero. But for the men who lived inside it, it was never a hero. It was a coffin with treads. We remember the Normandy landings, the liberation of France, the triumph in Berlin, but we rarely remember what it took to get there, and the broken bodies left inside melted hulls along the way. In the end, the story of the Sherman tank isn't just about flawed steel or failed tactics. It's about trust betrayed, about young men who were told their equipment would protect them, only to die screaming inside it. It's a story that echoes through time, because it reminds us what happens when victory becomes more important than human life, when production lines replace protection, when we let our soldiers become statistics instead of sons, brothers, and fathers. Today, there are very few Sherman crewmen left alive. The ones who remain rarely speak of what they saw, but their silence is deafening. Their trauma, a monument more powerful than any marble statue. And now it's our job to remember them, not as faceless warriors in old war footage, but as young men who climbed into a machine they didn't trust, followed orders they didn't question, and paid with everything they had. If you've ever seen a Sherman tank at a museum, look closer next time. Don't just admire the tracks or the gun. Look at the hatch, the one so many tried to open in their final moments. The one that jammed shut just before the fire came. That hatch is more than metal. It's a symbol of everything war takes, of everything we owe. And to the men who climbed inside anyway, we remember you.